been very impressed with there's a real lack of cynicism in the students. They're really lapping up what they're hearing. But it was quite noticeable I didn't get many thank yous. And then I made a point in one of the workshops to talk about gratitude, and then at the end of the workshop I got a whole series of thank yous. Isn't that interesting? That there's no bad will there, but we have to raise kids to develop better the habit of gratitude, because often they need a prod to be grateful, and that's not a good situation, because if we're not grateful people, we're taking the work of others for granted. I've talked about the 99, but what's sound judgment? You know, being able to set goals, being able to listen to others, accept advice, look for advice, that we know how to schedule our time, that we listen to conscience and we make sure our conscience, and the same equivalent as afterwards, you know, when you're working in a profession, you follow your professional standards. You know? We're always sincere. We realise that we've got to exercise management of negative emotions with our goal setting and our clarity of planning. And also we need to know how to divert emotional reactions, either by talking to ourselves, counting to 10, removing ourselves from the situation, having strategies that we don't blow up, having strategies to talk about it later. And this is probably every teacher's experience here, but sometimes you get kids absolutely stonewalling you because they're afraid of the consequences. And it's amazing how simply just asking the child to go and sit over there, we'll talk about this later, changing the context of the discussion, suddenly they tell you the truth. So we've got to be clever at helping kids overcome emotion when it's a blockage. So don't let your job description narrow. What you need to do really is to make sure that those 4 qualities of character are all developed. 10 tips for fostering virtue, and this more or less is the rest of the presentation. Okay, that's an obvious one. Look what Plato says. Anything a child receives into his mind, his or her mind, at a young age, is likely to become indelible and unalterable. Think of your favourite music. Think of your favourite sports. Think of what are your, you know, sometimes the way to, you know, when you've got a teenager who's you're really losing your connection with, sometimes the way to revive the connection is to do the things that he or she really enjoyed when they were younger. And suddenly you break through all of that teenage nonsense and you get to the real kid. We've got to be clever at this, knowing that we can use this as a strength, or it can be a liability if we let kids absorb the wrong stuff when they're small. Routines is an obvious one, but routines, again, timetables, routines, consistent expectations from mum and dad, this is the stuff of building habits. And habits are the stuff of virtues if they're done with a loving intention. So let's use routines for our advantage. What about delegating? We had a workshop on this. We used to have a workshop on this every year actually with the Year 2 parents at school at Redfield. And it was amazing how in some homes kids were virtually still in a stroller in Year 2, and in other homes they were doing the washing, they were cooking cakes, they were hanging out the washing. It's amazing, right? And one parent just piped up and said, if he's old enough to walk, he's old enough to vacuum. Actions motivated by love is sort of an obvious one, but how do we model that? You know, by the love of parents, kids learn what God's love is. So we've got big shoes to fill. So we have to be pretty good at this, showing that really love has to underpin everything we do. Vice can cramp a child's potential for life. Horace is this old soldier. Horace is a great guy. He wrote beautiful poetry, very lyrical poetry. But he was actually an old soldier. And he talks about how a young person's character is like wax for the growth of bad habits. And we see that. Kids, you know, if they pick up something that's not good for them, it seems to be there forever, once the impression's there. And you think of the kids you went to school with and how already in year 3, year 2, there were kids who were treating other kids badly. And they were the same kids treating other kids badly when they were in year 12. They've already learned that by the time they're in year 2 or 3. So we've got a lot of work to do with little tiny kids to develop really positive attitudes towards others, because a lot of damage accrues later. You know, they're the big losers, aren't they? They're the ones who lose their marriages through their own fault, etc. Don't do the thinking for your child. Nice story. Can you think of anything in the New Testament about how to raise teenagers? Can you think of the only situation where Jesus is a teenager, lost in the temple? How did mum and dad handle that? Remember, we've got the perfect parents, particularly mum is the perfect mum, right? We've got perfect son, we've got perfect mum. So whatever mum does is the perfect way to approach the problem. So when they find our Lord, well, there's a few things here. Let's just unpack this. First of all, he's on his own in a big city that he doesn't know that well for 3 days, and they don't find him in a corner whimpering. He's having this comfortable conversation with people. So they've raised him by the time he's 12 to be able to cope quite comfortably. Right? They haven't mollycoddled him. They've raised him to be able to manage. Second, when they find him, of course they're very worried, when they find him, who does the talking? Our Lady. Dad doesn't overplay his hand. What else do we see? Our Lady asks 2 questions. These are the perfect questions from a perfect parent. She says, why have you done this? Didn't you realise that we would be very worried? So everything comes back to helping the child understand the reasons for his actions and helping him understand that the most important thing, the most important measure is how our actions affect those who love us. I think that's beautiful. So we can copy that sort of behaviour. And the other thing that's very reassuring is Our Lady didn't understand the answer. So parents can be perplexed about the kids they're raising, and that's the way it's meant to be. And that just means you've got to trust God more. That he knows what he's doing, and you're doing your best, and we'll trust him. But it's very important for us to realise we're just doing our Lord's work in raising these kids. And therefore he's going to give us all the help we need to do it really well. How well do you teach your kids? You've got to give them the guidebook, right? They've got to know clearly what's right and wrong because they have to run their own lives. You're not going to be there running their lives for them. From mainland China, great kid, non-Catholic, non-Christian family. And I was talking to the father, and the father said that when he left home when he was 17, his father wrote him a letter. And this is wisdom from, this is like Confucius sort of stuff, right? My father wrote me a letter, and he said, my son, now that you are moving out of home, I must advise you 3 things. Don't do drugs, don't gamble, and don't play around with sex because you will need to be faithful to the person you marry. How's that for Confucius? Not bad, eh? Very explicit. Wrote it once, the son never forgot it. It's helpful for us to know that if you get kids in the right space. I remember the first letter I got from my father. I was probably surprised. I was away at camp and I got this letter. But, you don't forget this stuff, right? I actually do forget what he wrote in the letter. But the fact that I got the letter, I don't forget. And Jin, this friend of mine, remembered what his father wrote to him. This is not new. Odysseus, the son of Odysseus, remember Odysseus is lost coming home from the Trojan War, and his son says to his mother, Penelope, I want to go and look for Dad. And mum says to the boy, I don't want to lose